Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me there.
Yeah.
So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this presentation of the study into human factors for arc flash incidents. Good to see so many of you online already. I think the numbers are growing as we go here, so that's great to see. Thank you for that response. My name's Mal Chessels and I'll be your host today. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So again, welcome. Please make use of the chat room today with any questions or queries you may have. We do have time at the end of the presentation to actually run a Q&A session as well, but please feel free to drop anything into that chat session during the presentation. Just before we do get started with the presentation, could I just ask everyone to turn off their cameras and their microphones? It just helps with the bandwidth of the meetings when we've got so many people joining us. So just before we do hand over and get the presentation started, I'd like to introduce Donna Heelan, Executive Director of the Electrical Safety Office, to say a few words.
Thanks, Mal. Morning, everyone. Again, thank you very much for joining us. This is a great event and it's lovely to see so many of you online. I'm preaching to the converted, I know. You all know that one of the great aims of the Electrical Safety Office is to keep people in industry and the community safe around electricity. Sadly, when it comes to arc flash incidents, electrical workers are at the greatest risk of exposure. And unfortunately, arc flash in Queensland has been on the increase rather than the decline, with 10 arc flash incidents being investigated by the Electrical Safety Office in the past 12 months alone. This involves electrical workers working on or near energised parts and predominantly on electrical switchboards. The risks of these incidents include significant burn injuries from exposure from the arc flash, shock or electrocution, and damage to property caused by fires. And just like any other workplace injuries, the impacts have far-reaching effects for fellow workers, employers, family and friends, which I often refer to as the ripple effect that goes on forever. There is also the initial first aid and ongoing medical treatment impacts from our first responders and those that have to go through the treatment, and then the potential for extended rehabilitation periods. In an attempt to gain a better understanding of the situational causes of arc flash incidents, we engaged the professional services of Dr. Tristan Casey and Professor Richard Franklin, both of whom I'm sure are well known to you all. They were tasked to undertake this study aimed at the understanding as to why electrical workers in Queensland were putting themselves at risk by not correctly testing or isolating electrical supplies or choosing to work unsafely, and to inform the actions of the Electrical Safety Office, industry and our broader stakeholders to design actions to reduce the incidence of arc flash so Queensland can lead the way by zero arc flash incidents rather than the opposite. This is a really important piece of work, and with your help, we can continue to keep people safe around electricity. Thank you. Over to you, Mal.
Thank you, Donna. To start today's presentation off, we'd like to show a short video if we could. For many of you, you may have already seen what an arc flash actually is, but some of you may not. So we've got a short YouTube video here. There is no sound with it. We're just going to play it for you just to see what an arc flash really is. This is a simulated event in a test facility. Okay, so yeah, as I said, that's a simulated event in a test facility. That actual was in slow motion, and the actual time of that video was approximately 0.25 of a second. So that's how quickly these events can occur. I'd like to now introduce our presenters for today. So we'll hand over now to Dr. Tristan Casey and Professor Richard Franklin. Thank you, guys.
Hey, Mal, thank you very much for that. And thanks for showing the video clip so that people can see how quickly and how devastating the arc flash can be. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm meeting on today. That's the Bindal and Wurruguruba people land, and I pay my respect to their elders current and emerging and thank them for their custodianship of the land. And I say Wadamuli, which is welcome in the Bindagubba language here in Townsville. So as already mentioned, myself and Tristan worked on this project looking at arc flash. We'll take you through what we did in the study and the things that came out of it. And then at the end, we'll be open for any questions that people might have. So what I thought we might do is just start off with a story from one of the actual events that had happened. So the boss had asked him to switch the power off. We'd organised for this to happen, but then on the day he decided to push through, he slipped and headbutted the bus bar and died. The amount of times people have pushed through before and gotten away with it. So again, these stories that you'll hear throughout this presentation and the information that we bring reinforce both the challenges around arc flash and the speed at which it happens. So we were asked to do a couple of things. We were asked to assist the ESO in understanding why electrical workers put themselves at risk by not correctly testing, isolating supplies or choosing to work unsafely. And secondly, we'll come up with some actions or some recommendations about what we can do to prevent future arc flash incidents from occurring. So in a good sort of academic fashion, we kicked off by starting with doing a literature review, looking at what other people have done across the globe, and we pulled that together, and you'll hear a little bit more of the details that came out of that. We also did interviews with key stakeholders on a range of different levels, from electricians through to regulators and people in between. We also did a review of a number of incidents that had occurred over the last few years and pulled the information together around those about common situations and then prevention strategies that could occur to lead us into the recommendations. So in the second story that I want to tell you, we were working on a big DC circuit. It was in a lift room with 1500 volts DC that run the trains and run the lifts also. Control panel was a wooden panel with open contactors covered in dust and black. We were in the lift room holding the contactor in, but someone was in the basement holding the button down. The motor tried to go into reverse, panel exploded. Someone else was operating the lift without our knowledge. So I'm sure all of you out there can think about, there's some things that we can already see that were occurring and the challenges that we face as we work through these, what can be devastating events, from deaths through to significant morbidity as part of that process. And you could see from the video that we played before how quickly it can occur and the sheer devastation of an arc flash. I'll now hand over to Tristan to talk a little bit more about what we did.
Thanks, Richard, and good morning, everyone. You're probably wondering why I'm wearing the big jacket. I'm actually in London, in England at the moment, living here now. So just excuse me if I start shivering in the background. It's very cold here, which is probably quite different to your experience. So the story that Richard just mentioned really, I guess, highlights the focus or the, I guess, the perspective that we put on this particular study. And that's not, I guess, about blaming the individual workers or focusing in on what the workers have done wrong or where they might have deviated from procedures. That's certainly an important part of the project. But really what we're interested in looking at is, well, what are the deeper factors? You know, how do we move beyond operator error and start to understand the more distal, more deeper factors that might have precipitated some of these behaviours? So I'm sure some of you might have heard these statements, you know, as you've talked to other folks out there in health and safety land or different consultants or even training programs that you've been involved in. You might have heard things such as, well, you know, 90% of safety incidents are caused by maybe unsafe workers or unsafe acts. People are fallible, and the only real solution we have is to constrain them, to put more rules in place or put more procedures in place to lock down their behaviours even further. Others may have talked to you about the concept of what we call accident proneness, that people have certain personality traits that just predispose them, you know, to being more involved perhaps in safety incidents, you know, perhaps due to their lack of attention or the risk-taking impulsivity that they may have. So although these facts or these ideas have some truth to them, Ultimately, if we're going to advance the safety of electrical work further, in particular arc flash prevention, we need to come up with more complex, more satisfying solutions, which I guess represent the fact that individual behaviours are shaped by factors that are outside the operator's control. We need to go beyond those human errors and violations and actually understand what shapes the performance of people at the front line. What is the environment or the context in which supervisors, managers, even industry players like unions and associations and the legislative frameworks all create for that frontline person doing the job? How do we understand that broader context? Now, I guess one of the sayings or little analogies that has stuck with me over the years is one by a fellow called James Reason, who some of you may have heard of, a very famous safety psychologist here in the UK, actually. And what he said is that we can almost waste our time swatting the mosquitoes. And what he meant by swatting the mosquitoes is the unsafe behaviours or the little violations or unsafe acts that people do. And instead he says, look, we should look to drain the swamps in which those mosquitoes actually breed. And he means, tackle those distal factors, those latent conditions in the organisations and the teams that create or shape the practices of the frontline workers. And so I guess what we find ourselves at today with modern safety ideas and thinking is that rather than fitting the person to the job, we say, well, let's fit the job to the person. Let's shape that environment in which they're working. Let's look at upstream supply issues, manufacturing issues, the legislative frameworks and legal liabilities that people have to help shape their behaviours in more functional and effective ways. Human factors, if you've heard that term before, I just wanted to clarify exactly what that's about. It's a perspective on safety that looks at, well, how do we optimise that sort of interaction between the person and the work or the technology that they're operating with. We think more broadly about what we call the socio-technical system. And what we're saying there is just a fancy way of, the way that people think and sort of interact with each other, the social element, as well as the technology and the artifacts, the things that they use in their everyday work activities. How do those two things combine in an organisation to create work? We also think about, from a human factors perspective, how do we optimise both the physical and the psychological environment? The design of equipment, the design of the workspace, those ergonomic considerations as well. And often human factors is about participation. How do we work from a bottom-up perspective to involve workers, consult with them, and understand some of the challenges that they might be faced when they come to do electrical work? So next slide, Richard, if that's okay. So a little bit more detail on what Richard just started to talk about before, the explanation of our approach. We focused in on, I guess, the most recent and highest quality literature that we could find on this space, and there wasn't a great deal, unfortunately. A lot of sort of highly technical engineering type topics about how to calculate fault currents with different scenarios and different situations, but not so much on the human factors side of things. But we were able to find just under 20 high quality articles that we summarised and put into a literature review. We then used those articles or literatures to look at or create a coding framework. So going to have a bit of a structured approach to the rest of the project based upon that foundational research. Then we conducted about 23 stakeholder interviews and focus groups. So some of the people that were part of that project are here today, which is great to see. And really, we consulted with those folks who represented what we call the micro level, which would basically be actual operators or managers involved in the work. The meso level, which is more of the employers and business owners. And in the macro level, which is the government stakeholders, inspectors, and unions and associations. So we've got a really nice snapshot across 3 different levels of the work system. We basically broke down those interviews into what we call codes, so little bits of meaning that we could then analyse, and reviewed 15 Electrical Safety Office arc flash specific incident reports. So a really comprehensive approach to sort of unpack, where do these incidents come from and what are some of the human factors reasons why they exist. And then we came back to synthesise that and come up with some recommendations, which are part of our report. So in terms of the outputs or things that we could sort of stand behind and say that we've produced as part of this partnership with the OIR, we developed a review report, which is hopefully going to be published soon through OIR. There was a peer-reviewed published journal article, which we've actually been able to put online for everyone to access. So it's what we call open access. You can go straight after today's session, jump onto Google Scholar or Google, and just type in this title, and you should be able to find that article free of charge. So that'll give you a little bit more detail about some of the methods and results of the project. We're able to come up with that integrative report as well, which will be part of the publications that come forward at the end of this program. And we're looking at presenting another peer-reviewed article, which hopefully can be open access as well. So there's a bunch of things that you can take away after this presentation if you're curious and want to learn more. There'll be much more information coming quite shortly around that. Thanks, Richard. Now, the first phase of the project was that literature review, which was essentially looking at, well, what have other people investigated here? What do we already know about this topic of arc flash safety? And as I said before, the literature was a little sparse. We had to look a bit broader and look at electrical safety in general, and then narrow in our discussion around how that might relate to arc flash specifically. But it did set a good foundation for the rest of the project. Really, the high level, and it sounds quite simple and basic, but the prevention of arc flash is a complex issue, which we've come to appreciate. You can see a laundry list there of some of the factors we identified in that literature review. Things like the equipment, the weather, the space that people work in, all these types of things combine to create a context in which people do their work. We'll come back to this list of factors a little bit later in the presentation to talk about our specific findings relevant to this project. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Tristan. Another story from the front line. I was about 10 years into the trade. I was watching an operator change over a set of fuses on an old unit manufactured in the 80s. It hadn't been serviced in a long time. This guy was doing everything right. With the link stick, it was about 4 meters long, and he was pulling a set of inline fuses out. As he pulled back, it created an arc because the fuses blew, and there was a big explosion. The whole team was standing back. No one knew it was going to happen. And this again summarizes some of the things that, when we started to look at it, as Tristan was saying before, we thought that this would be kind of a reasonably easy project to look at when you start to think through some of the issues around it. But often people are caught unawares and not thinking through some of the situations in which they're in, and it happens very quickly. So when we started to look into some of the safety practices that were going on, we started to think through some of these issues, and you will have heard some of these before, but this is what started to come out from the literature review, from the interviews, as well as from the incident reports. You can see that there was a need to wear appropriate rated personal protective equipment. And again, thinking through what does that mean and trying to get a greater understanding of what that equipment kind of looks like. But there was also a need to check and maintain the equipment to make sure that it was in good use beforehand, and also remaining vigilant for the potential for arc flash risk and the suspicion that controls are intact and functioning well. A number of people talked about kind of the poor condition. And when we talk about condition, not only was it poor, but people were often working in small confined spaces or in poorly lit areas as well. So it may have been hard to pick up on and see some of those issues that were kind of going on. Well, there were also issues around using the right tools for the right task, such as insulated screwdrivers, but also making sure that you had places where you could store and not have to put stuff on top of equipment or in equipment, which happened in one case, causing the arc flash. There was also issues around the risk assessment and what does that mean and how do you do it and the way that you kind of work through it. And there was a bit of discussion, which was, I thought, quite interesting around working on live versus non-live equipment. There was a little bit of discussion where people were saying, well, you're more careful when you're working on live equipment because you know that it's live. And sometimes people are more complacent when they're not working on live equipment. However, the piece that they might be working on might not be live, but the pieces of equipment around them may be, particularly where you've just isolated one part of the board. They also talked about this issue around dead or de-energized. And again, people said that there is a difference between it being actual dead or on making sure that it's de-energized as opposed to just being switched off. So again, some of the challenges in testing, how do you do that? What do you need to do? And what are those procedures that kind of go through as part of that process? They also talked about this kind of shared model beforehand. And again, it was really quite interesting as we looked at it, that there certainly are different ways of operating depending upon whether you're in a large workplace or a smaller workplace, and the challenges are somewhat different as you work through. And again, thinking about isolating, how do you isolate them? How do you let other people know that you're isolating them? And then there was a little bit of talk about this kind of cascading issue where if you're getting somebody upstream, like the supplier, to isolate it for you, you then need to make sure that you're running on time to meet the times that they're set. And often if something goes wrong, you might try and cut corners to meet that because it's difficult or challenging, they felt, to get the supply back on or get it turned off at different times. And then there was a downstream side of that as well, where there was pressure to get the job done so that the business could be up and running, or the home, or people felt that there was additional costs for the person being there for longer than what they thought as part of the process. We also noted a whole range of issues around communication, particularly this kind of miscommunication or unclear communication, i.e., people weren't aware that others were working in another area. So it goes to some of the isolating and some of the toolbox talks that we brought up before, and thinking through these real challenges about what does good communication look like in your workplace, and how do you make sure that people know when these kind of risky situations are potentially occurring. There was also this issue that I talked about before about situational awareness, not knowing what was going on around you. And that included not just the person working on it, but also some of the bystanders. So again, we talked about small space, and there was certainly one of the incidents where people had to walk past that space to get to and from another area. So again, you needed to isolate not just the piece of equipment that you're working on, but also the space. And so when something went wrong, both the person working on it plus bystanders are then injured as part of that process. And then we talked about kind of the issues of just getting access to the equipment. So again, in small spaces with poor light, wearing protective clothing and having to get into areas to put screwdrivers in to unscrew parts of it to get access to what you need to do is potentially challenging again, and can take time to do that. And particularly if you're unfamiliar with the area that you're working in or haven't worked there before. And then trying to cut corners, as we all know, omitting a step in the safety procedure because you think that it's not needed, or that it might speed up the process as you go through. And again, we saw that occur. And just the general challenge of working around electricity. It's a dangerous, potentially dangerous piece of or hazard. And so needing to understand what's going on with the energised parts, who's working on them, what do you need and what don't you need as part of that process, and the live parts as well. So again, really complex. And as we started to unpack this, we realised that there were a range of different areas that placed people at risk when working on them. So we came up with this model around it, and I might hand over to you, Tristan, to talk a little bit more about the model and what came out of these kind of at-risk findings.
Cheers, mate. Thanks for that. Now, Richard's just given us a really nice overview of some of the safe and unsafe or at-risk behaviours or practices that the electrical workers were found to be engaging in. And we gathered those from the incident reports as well as the interviews and focus groups that we did with the stakeholders. But it's time to step back now and think, well, if we target just those practices, we'll just be swatting the mosquitoes. We won't be draining those swamps that we talked about before. And that's what this model is trying to encapsulate, the fact that as the individual, the human head sort of here suggests, there's a psychological process, there's behaviours that people engage in to manage risk. And it's really that cycle of, well, I see the risk, I perceive that there's something there. That's the first step in the psychological process. I make a decision then about whether I will, engage in that safe behaviour or that at-risk practice. So there's a bit of a decision balancing process happening. I'll then act and then maintain that control over time. So there's, I guess, different factors that impact that four-step cycle as individuals or workers go about their activities. When it comes to unpacking, well, what are some of those factors? We can start to look at, well, the individual psychology type factors in terms of fatigue or stress, inattention and distraction, all those types of individual level phenomenon, I guess, that could impact those psychological stages when it comes to risk management. Then we move to the environmental factors, so things that might be just physically present within the workspace. We've mentioned a few of them already, like lighting and weather and climate, those types of things. before moving to more of the meso and macro factors like the organizational structure, the management team, and the industry factors. So the model's basically suggesting that when it comes to focusing in on the sharp end, we have to put equal or if not more emphasis on the blunt end of the work system, those things that sit outside and actually shape the way that people do the job. I guess that's really, the main point of that particular model. Now, we could probably do a presentation just on this particular table, and it might take a couple of hours, I guess, to explain everything that we found. So I won't labour on every single point here, but just pull out a couple that I think might be most interesting. When it comes to maybe some of the environmental factors that we've discovered, we've talked a lot already about the design, the condition of equipment, but one that was really stood out to me as I was reading some of those incident reports was one around solar technologies and the fact that there's a lot of modular type technologies that are developed, but they may not have the human operator and maintainer in mind when those things are being developed. And that stood out for a couple of the incident reports that we looked at, was this idea that, well, you sort of design a piece of a modularized piece of equipment, but you're not thinking about, well, how's the operator going to reach in and be able to see what they're touching or access that equipment in a safe and effective manner. So this is really where we start to have interactions with designers, suppliers and manufacturers to say, look, let's consider the human element as we come up to look at maintaining this gear over time. For the individual factors, some of these won't be a surprise to you, like sort of this perceived pressure to get the job done quickly. And often that can be self-imposed, but often shaped by customers, by managers, by people that sit outside the work operator. One of the things that really stood out to me in this individual factors group of elements was really the knowledge required to deal with arc flash successfully. So for many folks that we talk to, industry awareness of the issue is not great. It's starting to get better with various videos and other awareness materials that OIR and others have produced, which are quite good. But there remains a lot to be done, such as integrating training into apprenticeship programs and ongoing refresher and skills maintenance for established electricians as well. So sort of that idea of the unknown unknowns, this hazard that lurks behind the switchgear that many operators just aren't aware could be there. And I think that may be a precipitating factor for many of these incidents. Moving now to the team and organisation, I think one of the most interesting ones for me was management of change, particularly scope change on particular jobs. And again, some of the incidents and interviews we conducted really highlighted that arc flash risk increases when change isn't managed well on the job site. So an example that comes to mind was a demolition job where they were dismantling some old switchgear. And in the moment, the supervisor decided to extend that demolition work to another area of the board that was actually still energized, but they didn't know about it. So again, just whenever the situation changes, it should be prompting that ongoing dynamic risk assessment that operators should be engaging in with the support of their management team and their supervisors. So change is another flag for a risky type situation. Supervisor leadership, again, another critical element, this sort of safety leadership concept about how we sort of inspire and motivate and guide operators to do the safe practices on the job site. And so this sort of relationship that we have with our leaders, the quality of the communication, the effectiveness of that relationship, will really shape the practices of people on the front line. Talking about macro factors now, so the last little bunch of elements here. What stood out there for me was around management commitment and how it interacts with customer demands and expectations. So some really powerful stories were shared by senior leaders directly that we interviewed, who talked about this sort of pushback that they had on customers to say, look, we're prepared to walk away from jobs where the pressure is just too great and we feel the risk has gone past a certain threshold. So for me, that's a really strong example of management safety commitment, this sort of willingness to put the safety of their workers first and actually walk away from jobs if they're financially able to, and really make sure that safety is prioritised. And that can be tough sometimes because we have customers in this sector, and particularly in the commercial sector, where disruption of electrical supply can be quite disastrous to them financially. So the nature of the arc flash risk really does rely on the management of pressures and demands, both the demands from customers on the organisations and how those are conveyed downwards to the frontline operators and sort of the messages that supervisors convey to them. Probably the final point just to mention today would be around the different industries. So that last factor, the industry factors, differing maturity levels between different sectors that we consulted with. So very different levels of maturity from the mining and power utility sectors as opposed to residential and commercial construction or electrical work. So by virtue of maybe some of those workers cross-pollinating into different sectors, different industries, we'll be able to leverage some of those powerful practices and start to improve the sophistication of arc flash risk mitigation into the future. And a great question came up at one of our previous presentations around this issue was, well, how can we kind of make sure that some of those legislative changes, some of those maturities around labelling of switchgear and sophistication of fault current potential, how can we start to take up that knowledge and pass it down to other industries that may be struggling in this space? So I think that's an area of work for the future. Thanks, Richard. We can go to the last slide there. So trying to put it all into one piece, we've got our little wagon wheel model here, which looks a little bit crazy on first inspection, but what it's really saying is how do we put all these pieces together into one pie? And we're saying that, well, the individual work practices, the piece in the middle, is a function of all those macro, micro, meso factors that sit around the outside. Not only will those factors directly influence the way that people do the work, but they'll also affect the 4-step psychological process that people go through when they're managing the risk of arc flash incidents and electrical safety in general. So when it comes to things like risk perception, deciding on what controls to use, implementation, and then maintaining and reviewing the controls, different factors will have different priorities or different influences at each one of those steps. We see, for example, the role of safety culture and climate having a major impact on whether people actually engage in behaviours. So having the right culture will shape and guide people to have the right, I guess, the safer way of doing things by default. Something else, I guess, that might be of interest is around the individual factors and how they shape risk perception. So when it comes to things like maybe distraction or inattention, being overloaded with too much work or too much workload, we'll start to see that risk perception start to be influenced in negative ways. So each one of these factors has a different role to play. And then, of course, around the outside, we've got our legislation, standards and regulations, client pressure and demands, and the industry characteristics as well, all shaping and flowing into to influence the work practices of people in the middle of the wheel. So that's that one done, Richard, if we wanted to move to your recommendation slide. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tristan. And I want to say that when we put this together, we were thinking about the hierarchy of control. So when we talk about human factors, it doesn't mean that we're just looking at the lower end around certainly management and PPE, because human factors come into, as Tristan was talking about before, that whole culture about how you accept it and putting your hierarchy in place. And so you need a workplace that's thinking around all these sorts of issues. What we did then was pull all this information together that we've got from the 3 different bits, so the interviews, the literature review, and also looking at the incident reports. And we came up with these kind of recommendations or things that we think should be the next steps in trying to reduce the number of arc flash incidents and keep people safe in their workplace. So we certainly think that there needs to be an arc flash awareness and education campaign targeting multiple levels of the work system. So again, often when you see these education campaigns, they're either targeted at workers saying kind of be safer. And as you could see from the work that we've done around human factors, we want to also target the workplaces saying that, you don't want this to occur, and what are the systems and activities that you're putting in place to ensure that you've got a good culture and you're keeping your workers safe. But it may also be that there's a need to inform the person that's buying the service to make sure that they're not kind of saying, hurry up, we need things done quickly, and putting the pressure on that then might lead to some of the incidents from occurring. We also recommend reviewing the existing electrical license testing and skills maintenance practice for arc flash prevention. So again, making sure that people are aware of, have the skills to, and know what to do around preventing sort of arc flash from occurring. This also then leads into the next one, which is around the curricula for apprentices, and making sure that they get specific information about arc flash that is relevant to their different industry groups that they're working in, and again, knowing how to both recognise but prevent arc flash from occurring. Also, that we ensure that the reviewed Electrical Safety Act and regulations are supported by a worker level awareness campaign that focuses on working on or near energised equipment. So again, as Tristan was talking about before, regulation is just one part of the tools that we need in our kind of prevention strategy, and obviously making sure that workers in particular know that if they're feeling uncomfortable or feel that they're at risk or that there is some sort of safety issue, that they know that they are supported by the regulations, obviously, and can bring that up to their managers to keep themselves and others in that place safe. Also looking at around the Electrical Safety Office compliance monitoring enforcement policy surrounding electrical safety incidents, with a focus on how arc flash events are handled after being reported and how industry reporting can be encouraged. So again, we wanted to know more about what was going on. In particular, there was a lot of talk about, well, these things nearly happened, and so how do we pick up on some of the near misses and learn from those? But also, how do we learn from some of the events so that we can prevent future events from occurring as part of that process, and making sure that the office is obviously about compliance, but also about helping people be safer as part of that process. And so helping them think through what that is and what that looks like for a much more integrated industry and safer industry as part of that process. And which leads kind of to the next one, which is about the relationships and networks between the regulators, associations and unions, to make sure that we capture, disseminate, and talk about the stories. I think one of the things that was very interesting for me was that everybody that we spoke to had a story about an arc flash incident that they knew about or had been involved with over their working life. I think this is encouraging that people recognise it and kind of know about it, but it was also kind of scary that everybody that knew about it but weren't doing something to ensure that they or their workers were safe as part of the process. And to get the outcomes that we need, it really is going to have to be a kind of concerted effort from everybody that's involved to make sure that we know more about them, that we're aware, that we know what the strategies are that we can kind of put in place, that we've got a really good culture around it, that we make sure that people are wearing the right gear, that they're undertaking their risk assessments appropriately, and that they're well supported as they do this sort of process, both from making sure that the pressures aren't on, but also, I guess, working, as we said before, with the suppliers that might need to turn off part of the electricity, and also the businesses or the workplaces that they're in, because obviously not having electricity, as we know nowadays, if you don't have electricity, lots of things stop working, including being able to charge people and take money, so that there is some real pressure around how long you can turn stuff off for, and the impact that that might have on the business, including if they've got refrigerated or frozen gear. So I guess from our perspective, I think they're really achievable recommendations that we think would help improve kind of the workforce, improve the safety, and make sure that we're all working towards a safer working environment. So I'll pause there. Tristan, was there anything that you just wanted to bring up about the recommendations for everybody before we open it up for wider questions to the group?
Not about the recommendations, mate. Just to say that arc flash isn't going anywhere in terms of its potential to happen. Given that what really struck the chord with me was the thoughts and sort of projections of the future that people talked about in their interviews regarding solar technologies and household storage and electric vehicles. They're introducing new hazards that potentially have very technical ways of calculating the arc flash risk that haven't been agreed. So I think there's a lot of engineering that needs to be done there to actually figure out, well, how do we do this calculation well, and what does this hazard look like in these new environments as we start to implement these technologies. So I think it's great that IER's been so proactive in getting ahead of these issues through this project and others.
Yeah, thanks, Tristan. And we might this is our contact details. So if people do have any questions or anything that they haven't been able to ask today, feel free to email us. But Mal, I might hand back to you to see whether there's any questions.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Tristan, as well for that presentation. I'm sure everyone will take a lot away from that with them when they go today. Yeah, we will open up to some questions, and I think maybe the best way to do it, we've noticed there's a lot of chat coming through, comments coming through, which is greatly appreciated. Some of them are comments, not actually direct questions as such, but it's a great opportunity if anyone does have a question to put straight to Richard or Tristan while we have their time with us today. Here's the opportunity. So if anyone does, please turn on your camera and your microphone and fire away.
So now I might just go to some of the comments that are in the chat. So thanks, Jane, for asking.
There, Richard. We've just got Lucinda there, it looks like, ready to ask a question. I'll just
go for it, Lucinda.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Excellent. Hi,
yes.
Tristan. Sorry, Tristan and I did study together a year or so ago. I just had a question around lean principles, and had a lot of experience in putting lean into manufacturing and things like that. And I thought this, when we're talking about the design of work, lean principles and practices have a really big benefit in setting up the workplace for influencing behaviours. So just wondering how you considered that in this review and study.
Tristan,
Thanks, Lucinda. Yeah, we didn't. Lean wasn't part of, I guess, the literature that we looked at, unfortunately. But I understand, how it might be relevant. So you're thinking about sort of like the idea of work insights and learning from everyday work and feeding that up into quality improvement type processes. So I think some of those things there resonate a lot with the contemporary safety thinking that we see coming out, in terms of resilience engineering and whatnot. So it could be a way of leveraging things that have already been tried and tested and evaluated. So it could be a nice way of innovating by bringing in things from manufacturing that other sectors or industries haven't considered before. So it's a good idea.
Yeah, just to add to that, Lucinda, I think it is a good idea as well. And part of what we looked at was trying to get a bit of an understanding how people perceive risk, particularly around the arc flash, and thinking through, because if you don't think something's risky, you're not going to do something about it. So we're kind of using that health belief model to try and help inform the way that we might move forward. And so part of that strategy, working with electrical safety office, is making sure people are aware that it is a risk. So a number of people kind of talked about, well, it doesn't happen to me type of thing, which is always a worry when you talk about safety. So again, using those learned principles would be really useful for people to kind of think about in their workplace. How do we make sure that we're learning from particularly near misses where something catastrophic hasn't happened, to ensure that we've got a safer environment? And as Tristan was talking about before, that also leads into the culture. And what we really want also from workplaces is this kind of learning culture, this ability to change the way that you work so it's safer. And obviously, what we heard back as well is not trying to put a whole lot of extra things in the way to stop the work getting done, so that it actually integrated into the work in a way that is both safe and efficient.
Thank you, Lucinda. I think we've got Julie Russell is sitting there waiting to ask. We've noted a couple of hands up as well, so we'll get to you as soon as we can.
All right, thank you. There's some really loud noise in the background. I'm not sure whether it's just me or someone else, but I'll work through. I'm actually going to ask a question. It could be totally in the wrong spot, but it's about trucks and trucks with vehicle loading cranes that will work to unload on the roadside. And if there are power lines overhead, there are some requirements around how far they can work within those power lines. And I understand it's because of arcing, and I thought it was the exact same thing you're talking about. But the example you gave me, I've never seen an arc flash, so I wasn't entirely sure, but I'm assuming that's all related. Now, our drivers aren't electricians. They have certain vehicle loading cranes will have a formal training with it, and you can get some, non-accredited training as well for smaller cranes. But what struck me was more about the different weather conditions that can actually probably change the range in which an arc flash could cover. And I've had some of our drivers talk about they could be quite far away, further than what are the legal requirements, away from the power line. But in, say, humid or foggy conditions, the current can actually travel across it and then and still connect. So I guess it's how someone who has no knowledge of electricity, how would they know to look at those conditions? How are we as employers who you know aren't really, we're in the transport industry, we're not in the electricity industry, how do we know how to train all that, or should we be expecting that through our training programs that we get through RTOs to incorporate it?
So Julie, I'll have a first go at this, because I think the crux of your question is really about, you know, for people that are not electricity related people, what is the training? What do they need to know as part of that process? I mean, what we looked at Arc Flash was particularly around electricians that are working on that should have a level of knowledge and be putting in place kind of the risk assessments around it. The power line one is a really interesting one. I do a lot of work with the agricultural industry, and we know we've had a number of deaths of people hitting power lines. Certainly the exclusion zones should be useful as part of it, but weather conditions do change, and people do need to be kind of aware and thinking about that. And what we've been trying to do is create kind of a culture of situational awareness, thinking about what's going on around you, keeping away from power lines and making sure that you're not going to come within contact is actually really important. We normally talk between 3 to 10 metres depending upon the conditions, so you don't want to get any closer than about 3 metres to power lines. But 10 metres depending upon the weather conditions and what you're doing as part of that process. I think some of the things you want to do is have some rules of thumb that are probably overly cautious in those sort of situations, but also getting people to think, well, am I going to be at risk is part of the challenge, and part of what we've been trying to do with Arc Flash, because there are a number of people that didn't even think that they're at risk doing these sorts of jobs. And so again, you know, letting people know when incidents occur, letting people know what's kind of gone on. Around that, we had an incident recently where a person came in contact with power lines, and as people rushed in to help them, you know, they weren't that close. They also collapsed. And so I think this is part of the challenge around how do you get your work systems in place, and a level of understanding that there is risk out there as part of that process. And so there are, again, understanding what the regulations are saying around it do provide some clear guidelines around that sort of activity. But again, making sure that people don't feel they need to rush, because again, we found that with the Arc Flash sort of activity, and that if they think they're going to be unsafe, that they can actually say something about it. Tristan or Mal, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd be happy to add something to that, Richard. I think you covered off very well the fact about situational awareness, and it's all about planning your work activity in the first instance. So it's about identifying where your work is going to take place, and for the transport industry, that's very mobile. So every time they pull up to operate their extendable arms, their hydraulic arms and the likes, they should be looking at what the work environment is around them. And other things, these useful tools online, the Look Up and Live app, which was developed by Queensland Energy, you know, for people who aren't aware where power lines are in the vicinity where they're working, that app is a wonderful tool to actually identify where those power lines are. And in terms of the 3 metres Richard suggested, that is the minimum distance that anyone should be approaching any power lines of any voltage. Obviously, if you're not from the industry, you're not aware of what voltage those power lines are. So that's 3 metres is the minimum. And obviously, as those voltages do get higher, that distance does extend as well. So that's something just to be aware of. All about it's planning your work activities in the first place. That's the key.
Thank you.
And I think just coming through the chat, there's a little bit about the regs that cover some of that, and there are some electrical safety training that you can do if you want to do that with your workers as part of the process as well. Tristan?
Yeah. Brilliant.
No, I'm good. I was just going. Sorry, Mel.
Go.
Here you go. Nothing on that issue. I was just going to point out Amy's great question there. So if we're talking to an apprentice, what would be the top thing we'd alert them to about Arc Flash? I think I really jumped to that question. For me, it's a little bit abstract, because I sort of found myself thinking about the management of uncertainty with Arc Flash, because a lot of these things are either things that we don't know about or unsure about, or we sort of know, but we're not quite sure what to do about them. So I think for an apprentice, that uncertainty is just magnified a lot. So for me, if I was talking to an apprentice, it'd be sort of thinking, well, or advising them about, well, if you're ever uncertain, stop and ask, which can be difficult, I guess, in a lot of situations because of the relationships and that sort of pressure to, just to appear confident and competent at what you're doing. But it really is about this sort of, building capability and knowledge from an early stage of their careers, getting these arc flash standards and information into the apprenticeship programs more formally, and sort of making them part of their on-the-job learning as well through the companies that they work with. I'm sure that, some of those bigger employers, people like CV Services and others that are very, mature in this space would have a great program in place to help bring up maturity of apprentices and capability of their knowledge. So yeah, it's really about uncertainty, I think, and managing that well.
And I think, Tristan, just adding to that was also what I found interesting with the safety procedures part of it. And again, people cutting corners and making sure that, the apprentice follows and understands what those procedures are as well. And a number of the incidents were what you call somewhat of an innocuous kind of activity that led to it. Like one of them, the person just had to put their screwdriver somewhere and went, oh, here's a spot to put it without even thinking, and that caused the arc to occur. So again, I think it is about being aware of what you're doing in the moment, making sure that you're focused on what you're undertaking, but also realizing, as you said before, that there is a real risk there, and to try and understand it and make people a little bit more aware about that it actually occurs and what the situation is around that. I think we've got another question now.
Yeah, we do. Jane, are you there?
Yes, I am. So, hi, Richard and Tristan. Now, I wrote the comment up there about the shared responsibility, and I just I got excited because I thought you were about to address it, and then the other question came in. So, I'm on the licensing committee with Keith. We see so many terrible things with arc flash, and we're seeing an increase of it, as Donna says. What I'm starting to think, and I wish I'd thought of this earlier because I know we're into a sort of a legislative review, but it's a case of kind of following the money, where the contractor is under such pressure to not shut down. And I see Keith's put a note on there: isolate upstream. That's the answer to mitigate against arc flash, is isolation upstream. It's as simple as that, but it requires the building owner to be part of the allowing that to occur. And my feeling is that if there was if it was forced upon the building owner to allow that to occur, then the contractor would be saying, doing the risk assessment with the building owner, saying, look, if we don't isolate here, someone could get hurt. How do you feel about that? And it takes it away from it being a purely commercial thing on the contractor, and therefore the some of that heat being taken off the contractor at that moment of being able to isolate that. And I'm just wondering what you think of that, and whether you think that's a reasonable approach.
So Jane, thanks very much for that question. I'm going to break it down to a couple of things. Firstly, one thing that was very interesting for us was, as Tristan talked before, about the different industries. So, for example, the mining industry has actually done a pretty good job of working through those things that you're talking about, making sure that it's isolated, thinking about the total risk to the business. So, the fact that if somebody dies or you have an arc flash and it causes your equipment to go down, you're offline for a much longer time. So they kind of understand the risk of that to the total business. One of the things that we heard, though, on the smaller side, particularly the retail sort of side of it, was this issue about pressure coming through. And kind of, if you think about the supply chain, there's the person that you're doing the job for, you as the electrician sitting in there doing the work, and then also trying to get the electricity supplier and trying to get all of those to line up, they found was particularly difficult. And if they were running behind time, often the time that you'd organise with the supplier then left, and they'd have to organise another time, which might be a day later or a week later as part of that process. So there is this kind of chain of responsibility that is certainly part of it that needs to be talked through and looked at as part of the process. And also a number of people said, yes, I'm on site and I've got the owner there in my ear saying, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up, and just talking about how do I respond to that and what's the appropriate way of doing that. So when we think about these human factors, it's not just about being a better electrician. It's also some of this communication and being better at bringing people along that journey with you and making sure that they also then understand what that risk is and the challenges. Tristan, anything that you want to add to that?
Just a quick comment, I guess, what really resonated with me in the interviews was this idea of legislation being either a shield or a weapon in the sense that sometimes it could be used, in unscrupulous ways by contractors to say that, well, we're actually able to work, in certain situations on an energized context. And so they might say that to pressure their peers or colleagues to engage in unsafe acts, but also as a shield, because those that were really clued up about the legislation could say, look, there's actually provisions in this legislation to say we can't work energized and we have to shut the power down. So I think clarifying, that building the education awareness about what the legislation can and can't do amongst frontline workers and contractors would be really helpful. So including some educational components there could potentially, make it a more useful tool.
Good one. Hey, Tristan and Richard, I'm mindful of your time. We do have a couple of other guests with us today who do have some questions for you. Are you okay to hold on for a bit longer?
Yep.
Yeah, fantastic. Michael, you've been sitting there waiting. Maybe Michael Kern, is it? Did you have a question to ask? No. Okay, then Kelvin.
Thanks, Malcolm. Just a quick one. I've seen a couple of the videos that Electrical Safety Office have done, and they're very good. But just for the probably the inexperienced people and the lady in the truck business reminded me of it. If a vehicle hits, say, a power pole, whether it be or a tractor or whatever, and brings that line down, I believe the person shouldn't get out of the truck, number one. Number two, the problems we're finding is people rushing to the incident and saying, and with all the best interests in the world to say we'll try and help this person, but they then get electrocuted when they're within a certain distance of that truck because the truck is live. What's that distance, or does it vary in, the further it gets out, obviously it dissipates into the ground, but the closer you are, the harder you get hit, I suppose. Distance-wise, I'm not sure. That was the only question I had, mate.
Yeah, and it's a very good question, Kelvin. And obviously, people want to assist people at need when they need their assistance. But we generally say at least 10 metres away, depending on the voltage of that power line. If you think about dropping a pebble into a pool, so that then the voltage is the highest right at that contact point, and then it slowly reduces as you move away from that point of contact. But the exact voltage is a bit of a calculation to determine. It relies on a number of things, on the type of soil. Is the ground wet? Is the ground dry? So we generally say stay at least 10 metres back. Call for assistance. That's the first thing. It's 000. Call for assistance. Get somebody there to assist you. Don't rely on anyone other than the emergency services or the electricity authority to tell you that it is now safe to approach that vehicle. Unfortunately, that driver is where he is, and the best thing for the person in the vehicle is to stay put. It's going to be hard, but you must stay calm. And if you're the only one there, obviously call for assistance yourself as well. If anything does occur and there is another emergency that says you have to get out of that vehicle, such as it catches on fire or something like that, the most important thing to do is not be in contact with the vehicle and the ground at the same time. So you have to get yourself out of the vehicle by opening the door and jumping as far as you can, keeping your feet together, and then shuffling your feet slowly away as you move away, or keeping your feet together and hopping. away from the vehicle. That way you're not actually putting that voltage that's in the ground across your body. Sort of, if you take a large step, the voltage will go up one leg and down the other leg, and that's the risk there with that. So the important thing is, whilst ever you're safe sitting in that vehicle, stay in that vehicle and wait for help.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Any other questions at this point in time?
Roger.
We have a hand up. Roger. You there, Roger? David Wilson, maybe.
Good morning, FD. Should the review assess like a permit to work structure for energised or live work or exposed parts?
I'm sorry, we probably missed the front part of that question. We're having trouble with the audio here.
I'll ask it again, sorry. Yes, around the skills maintenance and licence maintenance of 5 years for electrical workers. I think that'd be an advantage for 2 to 3 years. The electrical industry mightn't like that, but it would certainly make the day-to-day on the tools workers safer if we could measure their competence more frequently, and it would help the duty of care be discharged by employers.
Thanks, Roger.
The
I'm
second
happy to.
part was around, yep.
So I was just going to say, I know that's formed part of the, for those of you that aren't aware, Minister Grace has asked for the Electrical Safety Act to be reviewed, and an independent reviewer had been appointed to do that. And his first report's due to the Minister's office early next month. So I know that was one part of something the reviewer was turning his mind to. So we'll see what that looks like moving forward, but that's a good question.
Yeah, the second part was for arc flash and arc blast management. Should the safe system of work be more specific, specify a permit to work, and then the owner of the asset would have to sign off on it, i.e. landlords, residential, commercial.
That's something that we can take on board and give further consideration to, but we'll make note of that question. Thank you. David.
Oh, thanks, Malcolm. I just had a quick question. What sort of tools are available for electrical workers to determine appropriate arc flash PPE to address some of these arc flash hazards?
Richard, did you want to address this as part of your study, or we're happy to suggest a few different things, because the industry as a whole has PPE that is available, but what did you find through your studies?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically there are a number of different sites. You guys have some information on it. The UK also have quite a bit of information around the appropriate PE to wear. There are a little bit of calculation stuff that kind of went on around it. But again, I just jump on the websites because there was some really good information about that. And maybe, Mal, we can put some links up post this for people to check out.
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you. Mine more of a statement than a question. Our company, SafetyLec, has actually developed a arc flash awareness training package, and we've probably done about 15 training packages or training sessions at the moment. And I've identified 3 major issues and the first one being that the electrical workers just simply don't understand arc flash. It was probably mentioned in the first block of their apprenticeship and just simply don't understand it. The other 2 interesting things that I find is there's a perception that high voltage is the main cause of arc flash and low voltage doesn't necessarily have an arc flash associated with it, which is just not the truth. And the third part is DC. There is a significant lack of understanding out there about DC. Richard, I'm based in Cairns and quite often down in Townsville. I would love to catch up and have a cup of coffee sometime in the new year, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we'll have time for one more question, if anyone has one. Okay, no one coming forward. All right, look, thank you very much for your questions there. Hopefully we've been able to respond to all of those, and anything else that's in the chat, we'll definitely post back some responses to those as well. So I just hand over to Donna now for her closing remarks.
Thanks, Mal. Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Tristan. It never ceases to amaze me how articulate you are at midnight. I'm not as articulate at 10:30 in the morning, let alone at midnight in the freezing cold. So thank you for joining us at that time of the night. I've been watching the chat, and thank you very much. It really is heartwarming and pleasing to see so many people engaging with this very important topic, and the fact that more than 70 of you have taken time out of your busy days to come and listen to this research and next steps moving forward really shows to me that industry are on board and our stakeholders are on board to try and fix this. I'll use the term wicked problem, because I think it is a bit of a wicked problem. I think the key thing for me, and I hear it often, and Bruce put it in the chat, was we need to come over the "it won't happen to me" mentality, and that's often the case in electrical incidents and any health and safety incident. It won't happen to me, and sadly you can do the same thing over and over again and be rewarded by shortening of time and getting home early. It's the time you do it that you're rewarded by a serious injury or a fatality that you never forget. I also want to pass on my thanks to Hannah Mason and Jasmine Huang, who are part of Richard and Tristan's study team. The report has definitely provided us with greater insights into the incidence of arc flash and some key recommendations, which we will certainly follow up. What we'll do in this space is we're going to put together a working group to develop an intervention plan. I told you I wasn't as articulate as you, Tristan, to develop strategies and to collaborate with industry stakeholders in Queensland and beyond. Some of the things we've already done in this space that I'm probably preaching to the choir in relation to arc flash is Mark's story, which has been watched about 40,000 times online, which was about a lovely fellow who sadly suffered serious injuries as a result of an arc flash incident. And a number of comments in the chat related to apprentices and getting apprentices on educated and on board about the risks of arc flash. We've recently started an eSafe arc flash purely dedicated to apprentices to pitch things that are of interest to them and that we really want them to be across. We've got 8,500 subscribers to that eSafe electrical apprentice version. And if there's anything on there you want put on there or as a topic of conversation, please let us know. But also, if you know apprentices in the electrical space, they need not be in Queensland, they can be anywhere. They're more than welcome to subscribe to that free service. Again, thank you very much for taking the time to come today. The Electrical Safety Office really appreciate your time and support, and I'm happy to hand over. I don't think I need to hand over to Mal. I think I can close the meeting if you're happy to.
The meeting. You can run straight
He'll delegate to me. So again, thank you very much, and thank you again to Tristan and Richard. I wish you all a very safe weekend and a happy and relaxing Christmas, and wherever you are, I hope you get to spend time with your family and loved ones. It's been a difficult couple of years, and I hope that all alleviates sometime soon. So thanks again. We'll talk to you all soon.
Bye, everyone.